Migration. The movement of people from one place to another, usually to live or work. It can happen within a country, between countries, or from one continent to the other. Some people migrate for better job opportunities, safety, education, or family reasons. So, what are the pros and cons of migration? And why has the topic become such a big deal around the world? That's what's coming up. I am Eddy Micah Jr., and you are welcome to Africa Link, the podcast connecting you to the stories that matter.
Africa Link, every weekday here on DW.
According to the latest UN study, the number of African migrants increased by 30% between 2010 and 2020. However, many more Africans migrate within the same continent. So, what is the story of migration? For more on this, let's bring in Hardi Yakubu, Movement Coordinator, Africans Rising. That's a pan-African activism movement that promotes a borderless Africa for Africans. I also have our very own Diane, DW correspondent in South Africa. Hello and welcome to the Africa Link podcast. Hardi, first give us an idea of the general state of migration regarding Africans leaving the continent to Europe and the US. What do you think?
I think one of the things I first want to register is to recall the misconception about general migration trends in Africa. When people think about migration in Africa or of Africans, the first thing they think about is people migrating from Africa to Europe or America. Whereas the data shows, and this is data that has been published in a report by the IOM in collaboration with the African Union, called "Busting the Myths of Migration," where it is clearly, identified that the biggest chunk of people who leave Africa migrate to other parts of Africa rather than out of Africa. The second thing is to say that, having said that, there's no denying, that there's movement between Africa and other parts of the world,
right?
Europe and America, and I think we all see the kinds of conversations that kind of movement evokes. Reports about irregular migration, for example, where people are moving through dangerous routes in the Mediterranean to reach Europe, and then all the sort of rhetoric about security and whatnot.
I mean, you're right, because normally when we talk about migration, you hear from the Western angle, right? The Western perspective.
Exactly.
Is what you get, where you normally hear about, too many foreigners coming into our country. Mm-hmm. But you're saying there's an African perspective on migration, and the fact that migration happens more within Africa than beyond the African continent. And that's something that you find important to address. Why?
Well, because it sort of corrects the misconception that I think is in the minds of a lot of European policymakers, that unfortunately some of even our African policymakers copy blindly.
Before we go to Diane to get the South African angle on this, it's not to say that there are not quite a number of people on the continent that want to travel abroad or live abroad because they actually feel it's better there and conditions will be better for them than on the continent, because there are also a number of people like that. So we are not discounting that, are we?
Not at all. Not at all. And I think the third observation I wanted to make earlier was actually in terms of that. If we unpack it, there is a positive and negative sides to it. So, for instance, people travel, they think there is better life outside. They go, some succeed, and then they are able to send remittances and whatever to support their families back home, which is actually a major inflow of
Right.
of money into the continent.
We'll actually dig into that during the course because it's a good point you're making. We're talking about the whole brain drain situation. But before we get into that, Diane, I mean, when you talk about migration, South Africa is not new to that topic. It's somehow become a preferred destination for migrants, from other African countries. And it's really alluding to the points that we heard from Hardi Yakubu. So just put a spotlight on South Africa for us, Diane. What's the situation on the ground when it comes to migration?
Well, Eddie, you're correct. South Africa is what the government here refers to as a receiving country when it comes to many of the other African states. A lot of migrants from other southern African regions. So within the SADC region, countries like Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Swaziland, and surrounds are quite big senders of different types of people, both skilled and unskilled people, many looking for economic opportunities in this region. Some other factors that have really increased those numbers has been the instability in the Zimbabwe region that has caused South Africa to be a major receiver of many Zimbabwean people. And the government also had to create a special permit because there were so many Zimbabwean migrants coming to South Africa. There was a special Zimbabwean exemption permit created in 2009. And there are still, thousands of people still living in South Africa using that permit. If you look at some of the statistics, South Africa Statistics South Africa has said that there are about 2.4 million migrants in South Africa. Of course, that number could be more because there is a view that there are also quite a number of unregistered migrants or what the government often refers to as illegal migrants, and that number is unclear. And there are also quite a number of people seeking asylum and hoping to graduate from asylum status to refugee status, and a significant backlog in the approval of those. So it's quite a complex situation that we faced with here when it comes to migration in terms of also the reasons that people are coming to South Africa. Right.
And as you say, what the rhetoric that normally goes out there is that South Africa has a migration problem, and the government, keeps touting that there is a challenge. What are some of the challenges that they talk about regarding migrants? And can we be clear about what type of migrants they're talking about? Are they talking about illegal migration? Is that the issue, or just the fact that foreigners from within Africa are coming to South Africa?
Well, according to the government, their view is that there are many illegal migrants, and because it's difficult to actually get a definitive number, they haven't been able to quantify it, to say how many thousands or million, but there's a view that there are many illegal migrants. The response from the government has been to try and tighten policies and also to ensure that South Africa's borders are not that easy to cross. When you look at the border, particularly with Zimbabwe and part of the border with Mozambique, there isn't really, solid fencing. In some areas, people just walk across and they come and they do their groceries in South Africa at the shops close to the Beitbridge border and walk back over. But then, of course, there are those who don't walk back over and remain in South Africa. And there's been some tension that's been brewing with South African communities, as well as some civil society groups like Operation Dudula, which have fueled that tension in a way, where people are saying, some South African people are saying that if there are too many immigrants coming into the country, it makes the limited resources that are available, it stretches those limited resources. It makes it difficult for South Africans to get jobs. And the current economic situation is a really big hot button political issue here because of the high level of unemployment. So when you're seeing this pushback in South Africa against migrants coming, legal and illegal, there's a concern from some sectors of communities that jobs are being taken. The statistics, though, you would have to question whether it speaks to that, because of what Stats SA has put out. They said that only 4% of the national population is made up of immigrants. But I think it's also important to see where that contestation is happening. A lot of the time it's in lower income communities where there are very few jobs. And when some migrants are coming to South Africa and they're setting up shops or they are working in restaurants, then that does create that friction where some South Africans feel that those are jobs or sectors that South Africans should be involved in instead of migrants.
Right. Hardi, is that a fair argument to make for those that have issues with migration, mainly illegal, but also even with the legal, proper migration, that it just, puts so much pressure on, infrastructure, on health, on food, and so they are against that? Is that a fair argument?
Well, I think the South African case, and thanks Diane for doing a brilliant job at contextualizing. I mean, I was in South Africa back in November 2024, and we visited the Apartheid Museum and other places. And having reflected on some of the things that I learned at the Apartheid Museum, for example, where a significant proportion of the land still remains in the hands of the minority white population, and there's still the cramming of the Black population in the small aspect. And I saw just ignominious levels of land ownership. One person or one family, you see the land, and they tell you that this, belongs to one person, white person. You just not believe it. And, this is one of the questions that some of the people who are against the likes of, that are against Operation Kula are saying. Why is it that you are only targeting people who have migrated from other parts of Africa into South Africa, and not, everybody, every foreigner, if you are against people entering into.
Right.
So there is that particular political, social, as well as historical context to it as well. And I think it's quite widespread, actually, than is acknowledged, to the point where the political environment, calculations are made about politicians are making calculations about policy and election messaging and all of that, based on whether they should talk about what should be their message about the borders and whatnot. Otherwise, they lose certain aspects of the population.
Well, some experts say it becomes all but political, right? It becomes very political at the end of the day, where you have to find someone to blame for the challenges, and instead of then find some scapegoat. Mr. Hardi, I'm going to come back to you in a bit, but so Diane, interesting points that Hardi Yakubu raised. When you talk about migration, it's always looking at the bad side of it. But I'm interested to know what ordinary South Africans, think about migration. How do they relate to people from other countries living in South Africa?
Yes, definitely very interesting points made there. And I think he's correct to say that there's many other root cause issues that do need to be, unpacked for there to be a good understanding. The way that South Africans engage with it, I think it does depend to a certain extent on where the migrants come from. So when you look at something like digital migration, here in South Africa, it's really being touted as something that can boost the economic situation. Right now, there are calls for the government to make sure that can be visas for digital migrants that would allow them to work in South Africa and make sure that they're also contributing to the economy. The city of Cape Town, for example, has really been working closely with organizations like Airbnb, and there's been a positive aspect of that because there's a view that will bring money into the economy. There's also been a negative aspect of that because it's already starting to push up property prices in Cape Town. That is making it quite difficult for locals there to afford properties in some areas. Then when you look at the issue of African migrants here, it's also a mixed bag, because there are those people who I've spoken to who say that they feel that many of the African migrants, particularly those who own shops, are contributing to communities. The spaza shops have become a very hot button issue here, very contentious as well, because recently the government has said that it wants to crack down on their ownership, and there's a lot of economics and politics linked into that crackdown. Yes, so essentially they are convenience stores that are found in most South African townships, and the townships are communities where mainly Black South Africans live. And recently there was an incident where a number of children died, and the allegation was made was that these children died as a result of eating food from the spaza shops. Now, the investigations are still ongoing. The health minister said that in one of the cases, organophosphate was found in the bloodstream of one of the children, but the link between the organophosphate and the shops, that is still tenuous. Despite that, there's been this call for government to crack down on spaza shops, and in particular, immigrant-owned spaza shops. And part of that call, you do see it coming from regular community members. You also see it coming from organizations like Operation Dudula, which is an anti-immigrant organization here. And you also see it coming from local business organizations, and there's that economic aspect. But when you go to some of the communities, the residents there do say that these shops are helpful, that they're providing a service that they wouldn't get otherwise, because other larger companies haven't built up their shops in these communities, and they're convenient, they stay open quite late, and they're able to get basic needs there. So I wouldn't be able to say that there's only one view. There's definitely a mixed bag of views, but the voice that does seem to be coming out louder through the political rhetoric does seem to be the anti-immigrant sentiment, and that also could just be because they have access to platforms and access to media.
Interesting breakdown there. Hardi Yakubu, let me come to you, because you first started touching on it, the brain drain aspect. Recently, Germany has been pushing for skilled workers from abroad, and it is expected that a number of them will come from somewhere in Africa. How could that contribute to a brain drain for Africa? And is there any scenario where both sides benefit?
It's a very, very important issue that I think not much attention is being paid to it. Because when you look at the kind of development that we want, we need a lot of skills. We need a lot of labor and so many, other things. And then, it's usually hard. We borrow to fund our budgets to educate people from, lower level to higher levels. And then they go elsewhere to contribute to that other place's economy. Maybe in terms of the kinds of resources that people who go abroad also send back home, one can look at it as something that contributes to the local economy. But I mean, I haven't seen any study, but if I was going to compare that to if the people were actually there contributing to building the continent, it needs to be highlighted that migration is not just people moving from Africa to Europe. There are Europeans who are coming to Africa as well. And if you marry this point with the point of making travel easier, it's the reason why we launched the Borderless Africa campaign, to ensure that African people are able to move around, trade amongst themselves young people in particular are looking for opportunity. And there's a generation of young people who don't want to be limited by the artificial borders that European colonialists drew across the entire continent, and want to be able to collaborate with, people from Ghana, collaborating with people across the borders, and talking to people in the East, in Kenya, in Tanzania. Our movement connects people, in such a way that it's you can see the desire that people have, especially young people, to co-create the future, the collective future that we all desire for Africa. And therefore, these bottlenecks in terms of visas, the costs, the restrictions, the borders, and all of those things, putting a damper on some of these initiatives that can really help to get the continent to kick off. This is why the Borderless Africa is really important.
I found it very fascinating, the fact that your Pan-African activism movement is promoting borderless Africa for Africans. So as you rightly said, or as you just said, you're encouraging the ability for Africans to move within their own continent. Because I think there were some stats that I found some time ago that said it's relatively easier for people outside Africa, Europeans, for instance, to travel inside Africa than for Africans to travel within their own continent. And this is part of your statement to say that you want to see an Africa where, we can easily travel within the continent. But in saying that, I'm sure Diane also still listening. We're not necessarily against foreigners traveling also inside the continent, because at the end of the day, it's a global world, isn't it? It's globalization. People should be able to move back and forth and,
Absolutely.
make it work for them and where they're going to. Diane, South Africa has still been quite strong about trying to handle migration. Illegal migration is what they are calling it mainly. Tell us about this legislative changes that are being planned to address the migration issue. What exactly is it, and how far is it now?
Well, the legislative changes are still, I would say, in the infancy. The South African government, we have a relatively new government, which calls itself the Government of National Unity, which really is a fancy name for a complex coalition. And with all these different parties within this coalition government, there's still a bit of navigation about what the new policy is going to be. Before the GNU was formed, there was an existing immigration policy that was on the table for debate and discussion through the legislative process. But now within the GNU, there are different players who come from different perspectives. For example, there are parties in this coalition which campaigned very strongly on ensuring that the borders are tightened. And part of what they are motivating for is that whatever final policy comes to bear should reflect some of what they campaigned for. And then there are other parties like the Democratic Alliance, which is the second largest party, which has a more liberal approach. They do agree that there should be, proper border control, but their general view is that there are ways that those coming into the country can also benefit the economy, and we've seen that they've also been strong proponents for things like the nomad visa, which would definitely benefit a stronghold of the Democratic Alliance. So there's a little bit of a wait and see situation when it comes to that.
Thank you very much, Hardi Yakubu, Movement Coordinator, Africans Rising, Pan-African activism movement that promotes a borderless Africa for Africans. Also, thank you very much, Diane Hawker, DW correspondent in South Africa.
Africa is changing. Don't get left behind. Tune in to Africa Link.
As mentioned, migration is not one-sided, where only Africans are moving to the other side. Europeans and Americans are also migrating to Africa. Take, for instance, Ghana's initiative to encourage the African diaspora to return to the continent. We spoke to some Black Americans planning to move back.
I am an African woman just because how do we identify who we are? You look at your skin, right? So I didn't need that to tell me that I'm African. Anywhere that I go in the world and someone looks at me, I'm melanated. But my ancestors who wanted to return and come back home, those ancestors who never made it back, their dying wish was to come back to their home and they never made it. That passport for me is for them.
It just feels good to have a connection to an African country as an African American, as a Black American, right? Because back in America, we don't have anything to trace our roots to but Africa. And to have that connection here, I feel like, again, I've done something right.
Those were some members of Africa's diaspora planning to move to the continent. Now, across Europe, the rhetoric around migration has sharpened. Concerns over increased discrimination and restrictive policies grow as Europe shifts rightward. The return of Donald Trump to the White House has also raised fears of anti-migrant rhetoric and planned mass deportations. Please share your thoughts with us on our Facebook page, DW Africa. Listen to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. Don't forget to click follow so you never miss an episode. This show was co-produced and edited by Isaac Mugabe. And I am Eddy Micah Jr. Thanks for listening.